Good afternoon. A couple of things at the top. Schedule note, Secretary of State John Kerry and the Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter will co-host the Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop and Defense Minister Maurice Payne at the 30th Annual Australia-U.S. Ministerial Consultations, October 13th, in Boston. Secretaries and ministers will discuss ways in which the two countries can expand and deepen alliance cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond, from countering ISIL to the next steps on the recently concluded Trans-Pacific Partnership. The delegations plan to discuss alliance cooperation, developments in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, India, the South China Sea, and the Pacific, as well as global issues, including counterterrorism, Afghanistan, Russia, and, of course, Ukraine. This year's Osman coincides with the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Australia and the 10th anniversary of the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement. The ministerial will conclude with a joint press availability in Boston on Tuesday. Turning to Libya, the United States welcomes the October 8th presentation of the final text of the Libyan political framework, which includes the names of the senior leaders for the new Libyan government of national accord. This final text comes after months of tireless negotiations by courageous Libyans, and it is an important step in restoring peace and stability to Libya through the establishment of a government that will unify the country. The time to move forward and finalize the approval of the political framework is now. Libya continues to face many challenges, and we urge the House of Representatives and the General National Congress to immediately and conclusively endorse the final framework text and the senior government of national accord leaders. We encourage all Libyans to come together and support the formation of the unified government the country needs. The United States, for our part, stands ready to support the implementation of the political text and to ensure that a government of national accord and its institutions can function effectively and meet the urgent needs of the Libyan people. With that, Matt.
Really? You don't have anything else at the top?
Is there something else that you expect?
Well, I don't know. You know, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded this morning. I usually expect to hear something out of this building or the White House, considering the president actually is a previous awardee. Anything to say about the Nobel Peace Prize?
We certainly congratulate the winners for the great work that they've done in helping Tunisia transition towards democracy. We believe the award is well earned and well deserved.
Okay. Does anyone have anything else about that?
Is there any other toppers you want me to give on any other issue?
No, I just assumed that you would start with something like that.
How about football predictions this weekend? Anything? I mean,
can you help my fantasy league?
Can't do that.
I'm not doing well. Right. I wanted to ask you, start with Syria and the announcement that was made today by the Pentagon and others at the White House about this stuff. Presuming that the Secretary and this building is fully on board with it, will this new approach entail any more involvement from this building? Any less? The same? Which is, I guess, minimal, at least in terms of how it relates to actually dealing face to face with fighters.
I think, without getting into quantifying it too much, Matt, obviously we are deeply involved in continuing our work with the coalition through General Allen and Ambassador McGurk, and I suspect that level of energy and urgency will continue. I don't see anything with respect to the modifications that were talked about today. I don't see anything in there that would change our level of effort, focus, or urgency with respect to what's going on inside Syria. Yes.
Follow up very quickly. Now, I listened to the conference call from the White House.
Yeah.
Now, they're saying that the Russians are targeting moderate groups, moderate opposition groups. Can you identify those groups? Who are they? Who are these moderate groups that have been targeted by Russia?
I don't have a list of every group and every individual or unit that's been targeted by these Russian strikes. I'd ask you to talk to Moscow about further identification of what they're targeting and what their battle damage assessment is. as I said, and I wouldn't, even if I had the list, I don't think it would be appropriate to go into it from this podium. As I said before, though, the vast majority of the strikes we've seen them conduct to date continue to be against opposition groups and not against ISIL.
My question is inquisitive because you guys keep asserting that there are moderate groups. There are so many different groups in Syria. I mean, they're probably in the hundreds. How do you determine or decide that this group in this particular area is moderate and this group is less moderate and so on?
There is,
What
Saeed,
kind of- yeah.
there is, Saeed, as you know, a wide, disparate collection of groups that are in opposition to the Assad regime. And some of them have multiple levels of things and people that they are opposed to and are acting against, to include ISIL in some cases. There isn't one monolithic opposition group. There are several. Now they are represented, of course, by the SOC. But obviously, we understand that there's many groups, and they don't all share every goal in common. What I can tell you, without getting into great detail here, which I wouldn't do, and it wouldn't be appropriate, but I can tell you that what we've seen so far in terms of Russian military activity and the strikes they're taking, that they are predominantly against opposition groups. I'm not going to qualify with an adjective all of them as moderate this or moderate that, but the large majority that we've seen are against these opposition groups that are predominantly focused on the regime. And some of them, we've said this, some of them are groups that we have supported in one way or another over the last couple of years.
Just my final question on this. Now, the new program will include training leaders and embedding them among groups. What is the mechanism to do this?
Well, I point you to our colleagues at the Defense Department. This is their program, and I'm not in a position to get into too many of the details. Yeah.
And what about this is actually a question for NATO and your take on it. From where are we coordinating the flights and all this? Because the French are bombing, the US is bombing, all the coalition partners, Russians are bombing. Is it in Brussels? Is it here? Is it in Pentagon? Where is the coordinating point that there is no accident, there is no friendly, as we will call it?
There's no friendly what?
In case there is a friendly fire or a collision of
But
aircraft or something.
there's a coalition air operations center in the region that is coordinating the air campaign. I would point you to the Defense Department for more details about how they do that. That's a military function, and it's worked very well, coordinating the air activity of multiple nations that are flying missions both in Iraq and in Syria. And not all of them are airstrikes. I mean, some of them are logistical flights and that kind of thing. But to your point, I think is to deconfliction. And again, I'd point you to the Defense Department, but the very thing you're asking about is the reason why it's important to move forward in some fashion with a mechanism that can allow us to deconflict air operations in the region, so that there aren't misunderstandings, there aren't mishaps, and there aren't dangerous incidents where certainly coalition pilots are put at greater risk than they already are.
The question was more to find out what is the diplomatic efforts with Russia and all, because the defense is okay, but there is a.
Well, your question wasn't about diplomacy, but as I talked about yesterday, the Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov spoke again yesterday for nigh on half an hour, and I suspect that they'll continue to have discussions. And the Secretary was hard at work at the UN General Assembly last week, talking to Arab and our European allies and partners about the modalities of what a political transition could look like going forward. He spoke at length with Foreign Minister Lavrov about that very issue up in New York, and again yesterday. So I can assure you that at the very highest levels here at the State Department, a political track is being pursued. But I interpreted your question to be more about military deconfliction, and that's for our Defense Department colleagues to speak to.
And just one more, the EU, European Union Commission President has said that it's time to better relations with Russia and time to stop being dictated from Washington. Do you have any reaction to
I
that?
didn't see those comments, but as I've said before, and as the Secretary has said many times, there are many areas where we can and do cooperate with Russia, and the Iran deal is a great example of that. And there are obviously issues that we differ and we have deep concerns about. Ukraine and, of course, what they're doing in Syria. That is why it's so important to maintain a dialogue and to have a conversation. And that's why Secretary Kerry continues to speak to Foreign Minister Lavrov and will. It's why these deconfliction talks at a military level are important to have. Because if you don't have a conversation, if you don't have a dialogue, if you don't have a mechanism to discuss, then you really do get into an area where misunderstandings and mishaps and potentially much more dangerous outcomes can result. So again, the Secretary is very committed to working these issues through. It doesn't mean that in the effort in the act of diplomacy that we're turning any blind eyes to things that we find destabilizing. We're going to continue to raise our concerns and to make them as known as possible. Okay, Pam?
The original version of the Train and Equip program did not have the desired results. How confident is the administration that this new version will work? And then secondly, are there any aspects in this new version that address some of the underlying concerns, and that is that some of the moderate opposition is really more interested in targeting Assad than going after ISIL forces?
Now, there's a couple of things there. I think, and they addressed this when they talked about this decision this morning, that what they're going to focus on now are efforts that have proven effective in the past. In other words, everybody acknowledges that there were issues and challenges with respect to the training aspect of some of these moderate opposition fighters. But what has proven effective in the past, particularly in Syria, has been the equipping part of training and equipping. It helped us in Kobani. It's helped us in Iraq even before we had an advise and assist mission stood up. And we've seen that it can be effective when combined with the use of air power. And so what you're seeing now is a focus more on the equipping aspect of that formula than the training aspect. But I think they also made clear that nobody's abandoning forever the idea of training. It's just that there's going to be a pause here while a focus is more aptly put on the equipping aspect. The other advantage to that is that it does not remove from the field and from the fight Syrian fighters that are actively engaged against ISIL. You can supply them and equip them and support them while they are actively engaged in the efforts against ISIL. To your other question on motives or intentions, I mean, this was something that we addressed long ago when the program was first started, and we recognized that, as I said to Saeed, we recognize that not all opposition members, moderate though they may be, have a single focus on ISIL. In fact, some of them, we recognized then and now that some may be more arrayed against Assad. But our efforts, and we talked about this morning, our efforts in Syria are directed against ISIL. Our military efforts are directed against ISIL. Politically, the Secretary continues to pursue a political solution to a transition to a government away from Assad. But militarily, it's against ISIL. And so I think you can expect that the support given through the change in the program now will be support given to those groups who we have a measure of confidence are going to be going against ISIL.
John, a few questions.
Sure.
I'm trying to figure out how, I'm trying to get my head around how this would, if what you say is true, that the Russians are now also going after these opposition groups, that you're now going to equip, right? How does this change that calculus if Russian aircraft are not bombing ISIL, they're bombing the opposition groups that you're now going to be equipping?
Well,
What-
I don't want to get into, future operations and a tactical discussion about what group in what city or area is going to get a certain measure of support. That's really for my colleagues at the Defense Department to speak to. What I would leave you with, though, is that the support that's going to be provided is going to be provided to those groups that there is a measure of confidence in, both in their leadership and in their expected focus against ISIL. And as for exactly, what groups and where, I wouldn't get into it here. I wouldn't be able to get into it from here. What our message to Russia is, and it's no different, and it hasn't changed, is that we would welcome contributions by the Russian military if those contributions were against ISIL. If they were willing to go after the same target sets, not the same targets, but the same focus on ISIL, then that's a conversation that we would be willing to have and a contribution that we would be willing to welcome. If, on the other hand, it's going to continue to be, as it has in the last week or so, against opposition groups, then all that's going to do is make a political solution that much more hard to achieve, if not impossible, because through going after opposition groups, they are doing nothing but prolonging Assad in power, which makes it difficult to get to any kind of political solution, and they're perhaps inviting more extremists into Syria and exacerbating the violence in the country. So I understand the premise of the question. I'm not in a position here to go into great detail into exactly how, when, or where the equipping is going to occur. Again, that's really a military question. All I can tell you is that it's going to be done through leadership and to groups who we have a measure of confidence are going to be arrayed against ISIL.
Well, that's why I asked the question, if this is a change in strategy, what's going on? I mean, that these forces would also now have to repel what's going on if the Russians are bombing them. There would then have to be that. Was that in mind when you changed the strategy?
And it's a interesting hypothetical question, and I'm just not, I'm in no position to answer right now. And I think the modalities of how this process will occur is really more for the Defense Department to speak to, not here at the State Department.
Can I then also ask you that would the U.S. then kind of loosen standards towards which groups it supports? So does that line move to the right, kind of?
What line?
Would you be arming? Would you be willing to work with groups now that you wouldn't have previously?
I think I'm going to leave it where I said before, that we'll be working with specifically with those leaders of that have been vetted, and with groups that we have a measure of confidence are going to be arrayed against ISIL.
I have one more question. Do you? Is the secretary still pushing the issue of a no-fly zone? Given all this change of tactic in the last
No, I mean,
12 hours.
it was the way you asked the question that.
Well, according to
but
CNN report,
I know, I've read the CNN story. As I said yesterday, I'm not going to get into the advice and counsel that the secretary provides the president or to the National Security Council. I mean, that's that's not an issue to be spoken about publicly. Nothing has changed on the status of a no-fly zone. There are no efforts to conduct one or put one in place at this time. And we've talked about before that the recognition of the resource intensity that a no-fly zone would entail. As I've also said many, many times, we understand specifically the concerns the Turks have expressed in terms of wanting some kind of, they call it the buffer zone or safety zone or no-fly zone. We have steered away from that language in general and in practice, but it is a discussion that we continue to have with the Turks as we move forward. But as we're talking here, there's no change in and no plans to put into effect a no-fly zone.
I guess
Can I ask you a technical question? Because you've used this phrase now at least 3 times, and other officials have too, about this measure of confidence. What unit of measurement are we talking about here? I mean, how much confidence what is a measure of confidence? Don't you need to be totally satisfied that these people are not, rampant human rights abusers and beheaders, and confident that they are not going to fight Assad, but rather ISIL? I mean, I don't understand a measure of confidence. Is that a foot, a court? What is it that gets them across that hurdle?
It is not. I don't think it is. I don't think we can enumerate it, Matt. But it will be based on, has been based on, our knowledge of certain of these groups and certain of these leaders, and our experience with them in the past,
Right.
and our expectation of their future cooperation going
Okay.
forward.
But when you say a measure of confidence, it suggests that it's not. You don't have to be 100%. You don't.
It's
You might
not-
not even.
it-
You might not even have. I don't know if you can ever be 100% sure, but it's not even 90% or 80%. I mean, is it 50, 60%?
As I said, Matt, I can't, and I wouldn't enumerate this. It's based on knowledge and experience in the practicality of having worked with and vetted some of these leaders. Go ahead. You've been fairly jumping out of your seat there. Go ahead.
Why has the train and equip program not worked? Has the administration analyzed the reason why?
That's a great question for the Defense Department, and I think they've. Hang on a second now. I'm going to give you a shot. The Defense Department has talked about this at quite some length, and it really is and I'm not shirking your question. It really is a better question for the Defense Department. It is a Defense Department program, and I think they've been very candid and frank about over the last couple of months, in particular, about the challenges that they have faced in terms of recruiting fighters for the program. And not to get into this in any greater detail, but one of the great strengths of the U.S. military is the ability to adapt and to try new things, and not to be afraid to try a new approach. And sometimes that new approach doesn't work, and sometimes you run into obstacles and challenges you didn't know you were going to have, or you couldn't have predicted it. But one of the great things about our military is it's adaptive, and it's not afraid to A, admit when it makes a mistake, and B, change direction if it needs to change direction. I would also remind you that this particular aspect of the program is not being shelved forever. There's a pause being put in place while we focus more on the equipping side of those groups that are in Syria now and have proven competent against ISIL. But as for the exact laundry list of specific challenges they've had, I would point you to the Pentagon for that.
From this podium, you can't explain why
From this podium, I am telling you that it's a great question that you should pose to the Defense Department. I'm not saying I can't. I'm saying that it's not appropriate for those specific answers to come from this
Well,
podium.
the defense secretary, and you spoke to that several months ago, testified in Congress and said it's difficult to identify rebels with the right mentality who would not then turn over weapons and themselves to ISIL. Would you agree with that assessment?
I
now?
would certainly not challenge the assessment of the defense secretary, but if you already had that, then you probably already had at least some of the answer to your question.
But I want to hear it from you.
And I appreciate that. But I'm not going to give it to you because it's not appropriate to come from this particular podium. This is the Defense Department's program. I mean, it would be like asking me to run down for you Defense Department budget priorities or law enforcement issues that the FBI is
Right?
working about.
It matters for policy. In order for a new strategy to come up with a new strategy, isn't it important to analyze why the old strategy hasn't worked?
Well, 2 points. One, it's not a new strategy. The strategy against ISIL has not changed. It's still the same lines of effort are in place. Militarily, we're still going to go after ISIL with a broad range. Hang on a second. You ask the question, my job's to answer them. So the essential elements of the strategy are going to stay the same about how we're going to go after ISIL. With, oh, by the way, a coalition of more than 60 nations. It's not just the United States. So the strategy is not changing. The strategy is still to degrade and destroy ISIL and their capabilities inside Iraq, inside Syria. And it's not just about putting warheads on foreheads. It's about going after the ideology. It's about going after the financing. And all that work will still continue. Elements of anybody who knows anything or has any knowledge of history, particularly military history, will tell you that over time in a campaign, whether it's a war or a battle, military strategy may stay the same, but the way it's executed, implemented, the tactics can change. And so what we're talking about here, and I don't want to speak too much for my colleagues at the Pentagon, but what we're talking about here is the program is still in place. The authorities to conduct it are still in place. They're simply changing the focus away from the training element and more towards the equipping element. It was at the outset a train and equip program. They're going to change the focus to equipping. Okay?
Just to-
It's not a new
just to-
strategy.
Just to specify and to clarify, what does the strategy now consist of specifically?
The strategy.
What is the strategy against ISIL right now? What is the U.S. strategy? Can
It's
you spell it
exactly
out?
the same as we've been. I just answered that for you.
Just minus the train and equip program.
No,
right?
I just said the train and equip program is not going away. The training aspect of it is on a pause right now, and they're going to focus more on equipping. I just said that. Yeah.
Till now, what I've been hearing is that there is a talk with Russia going on, and there will be cooperation if needed. But at the press conference in NATO, the defense secretary he said that U.S. will take a multi-layered approach to support Syria against Russian aggression. Now, on here, this podium, you are saying that Secretary of State has talked to his counterpart, things are okay. And he's defining it as Russian aggression against Syria.
Well, I don't think there's any separation between how the State Department and the Defense Department look at what Russia's military activities inside Syria are doing. We both agree that to date, they have been counterproductive to an effort to pursue a political resolution inside Syria. And again, we can only judge Russia by what they've done, not by what they have said they're going to do, but what they've done. And if you just look at what they've done, it's been to conduct military strikes against mostly opposition members and not ISIL. Something I think I said yesterday, greater than 90% is the Pentagon's assessment of the strikes have been conducted against opposition groups. So we've said all that's going to do is exacerbate the conflict. All that's going to do is extend the violence. All that's going to do is keep Assad in power and make a political transition that much harder to achieve. So if you're asking me, is there daylight between the Defense Department and the State Department on our view of what Russia is doing inside Syria, I'd say absolutely not.
So you agree with his statement that it's a Russian aggression?
I'm not going to parse words one way or the other. I haven't seen those comments. I think what I just
It was
said
a
speaks for
press
itself.
conference at NATO.
I understand that, but I'm giving one now here, and I haven't seen that one.
Yeah.
So I'm just telling you, there's no change to our view of what Russian military activity so far has and has not done, and if continued on the trajectory that it is, won't achieve, which is what even the Russians have said at the outset that they wanted, which was to support Geneva and a political transition inside Syria. Hitting the opposition groups with 90% of your ordnance is not the way to get to that outcome.
So do you agree that this is a proxy war going on?
We talked about this again yesterday. Look, nobody,
Just say yes.
no,
Just say yes.
as much as I would love to be able to just spout Matt's wisdom up here, look, nobody wants that to happen, and there's no reason for it to happen and occur. That's not a productive outcome here in Syria. More bloodshed, more violence, more war. The Syrian people deserve better than that. They've lived with it now for 2.5 years. What we want is an end to that conflict, and it can only end politically, not military. Nothing has changed about our view that there's not going to be a military solution to that conflict. I understand there's a military component to the strategy against ISIL, and there will continue to be, regardless of what Russia's doing. But there's not going to be an ultimate military solution to the civil war in Syria. It has to be solved politically. Propping up Assad doesn't get you any closer to that outcome. In fact, in our view, makes it that much harder to achieve, and only extends the violence and bloodshed more, and inflames sectarian tensions, which are already high in the region. I get that. But by choosing sides like this, Russia's only going to exacerbate sectarian tensions, and again, that's not good for Syria or for the region. Yes.
By choosing a side, but you guys have chosen a side as well.
What side have we chosen?
You've chosen the anti-ISIL, anti-Assad side.
We've chosen the anti-ISIL side militarily, and I would remind you that 62 other nations are also
Right.
aligned against
But
ISIL
you're aligned
and in that
against,
coalition.
but you don't think that Assad is a credible leader, and you think he needs to go. So you've chosen a side, right?
We have chosen to pursue a political solution to the civil war in Syria.
If it's true what
And
you
yes,
say, yes, of
nothing's
course you've
changed
ta-
about the fact
but
that
you've
we
taken a
want a
side.
government that is more responsive to the Syrian
But
people and
you've
doesn't
taken
have
a
a
side.
side.
The Russians have taken a side.
The difference, Matt, though,
I
is that
understand that there's a difference. That you make the argument that there's a difference.
they've
But
chosen a side militarily and tactically in a sectarian way that we have not done.
okay, if in fact it is true, and I have no reason to doubt it, but if it is true that what the Russians are doing is making a political transition harder rather than easier, what does that mean about your, and not you personally, but the administration's belief several weeks ago or a month or so ago, particularly after the meeting in Doha, that in fact there was a change in the Russian position and that they were willing and more open to pushing for a political transition?
Well, at the time when
Did you get fooled? Did they trick you? Did they lie to you? Why is it that you came away, not you again personally, but why did the administration come away from the post-Iran deal glow thinking that there was some kind of change in what?
I don't think you were making a pun by glow, were you?
No.
I think coming out of the Doha meeting, and I believe it's fair to say that the secretary still believes that there can be a way forward here, politically and diplomatically, towards a political solution and a transition in Syria. And I would still maintain that coming out of Doha and the positive nature of the trilateral meeting there that he held with both Minister Lavrov and Foreign Minister Al-Jubeir of Saudi Arabia, that even still coming out of that meeting, he would tell you that that there is still a chance that there could be cooperation with Russia towards a political solution in Syria. He said as much last week at the General Assembly, and so did the President, quite frankly, that we would be, as a nation, willing to have conversations with Russia and with Iran at some point about a political transition. Now,
And then 2 days later, though, they started the bombing campaign began, and you guys changed your tune and said now what the Russians are doing is not good and is hurting a political transition. So
I don't believe there was a change in tune, Matt. We were simply reacting to a very kinetic, tangible reality on the ground in Syria, which is opposition groups getting bombed by Russian aircraft, which, to me, certainly speaks volumes and has over the last few days about what their intentions are seem to be. That doesn't mean that, and I wouldn't want to ever. I don't think we'd want to be at a place where there isn't still a belief in the opportunity to pursue a political solution, and I think the Secretary very much still wants to do that. It is made all the harder, though. You know, obviously, when we came out of Doha, they didn't have 40 some odd tactical aircraft added, to bases inside Syria, and they weren't flying missions against opposition groups when we came out of Doha. So things have changed. They've changed because Russia has made it change. They have changed the calculus on the ground. They have changed the situation. And as I said yesterday, the Secretary has not been bashful about expressing his concerns to Foreign Minister Lavrov about those changes and what they portend. But it doesn't mean that the Secretary is going to give up the pursuit of what he believes, what this administration believes, is ultimately the right answer for the Syrian people, and that's political transition. Saeed?
Thoughts on the yesterday?
It's
you
very
mentioned-
self-policing in here, isn't it? I just for the record, I was willing to change topics. I was willing to change topics 10 minutes ago.
No, well, because once you get on that one, we're never going to get off it. So
Ouch.
the one thing I want to ask you, yesterday you said they were discussing modalities of trying to get this political transition track going. What did you mean by that?
What I meant was the architecture of what a transition should look like. And I don't want to get too much into hypotheticals, but it would, it's how long do we think that transition is going to take? What role does Assad have in that transition? How long is he present for it? What happens post-Assad? How does a transitional government, how does it get established? How does it get entrenched? How does it administer itself? How do you get to long-term governance and stability inside? So all those things. But I wouldn't go into too much of the details. But those are the weighty issues that they had. They discussed at the General Assembly and continue to discuss.
And just one other question on the change on the more emphasis on equipping than training. Obviously, this was discussed with the allies in the coalition. Did they agree? They obviously agreed to what's to this.
I would again point you to DoD to speak to the specifics of this program and the changes to it, but clearly, what I can tell you is that key foreign partners, members of the coalition, were certainly apprised of this change in focus, and they would have to speak for themselves in terms of their level of support for it. I wouldn't do that from here, but there was communication with our foreign partners about this change in focus, as you would expect there would be, since again we lead this coalition, but we're certainly not the only member in
Was it done
it.
through Kerry as well? Did the Secretary get
No, this
involved
was
in this?
predominantly done through
Something
the Defense Department. I do think that in certain capitals, our diplomats were involved in those discussions, as you might expect, but this is obviously a Defense Department lead here. Yes.
New topic then.
You wanted to stay on Syria?
Last question. When United States airdropped weapons to Syrian Kurdish group PID last year in Kobane, Turkey protested. Have Turks expressed any concern regarding this new program since United States is going to arm PID again?
I would ask you I'd refer you to Turkish authorities for their views on this. I can tell you that they, as I said to Leslie, they were informed of how we wanted to change this program, but I think they should speak for themselves in terms of their views of it. Yeah.
New country, Israel.
Okay.
What's your assessment and your comments after 1 week of violence in Israel, in the West Bank, and now which is spreading to the Gaza Strip?
Well, we remain deeply concerned about all this recent violence and the escalating tensions, including those attacks that you referenced in Gaza today. We condemn in the strongest possible terms violence against Israeli and Palestinian civilians, and as the Secretary has done, and sadly we must do again, we extend our condolences to the victims and their families. And we continue to urge all sides to take affirmative steps to restore calm and refrain from actions and rhetoric that would further escalate tensions. I think the Secretary addressed this, I thought, very well earlier this week in urging calm, condemning the violence, and calling for a return to, at least in terms of Haram al-Sharif and Temple Mount, a return to the status quo, and for both sides to take the tensions down.
Does he plan to give a call to the leaders of the region?
As you know, he maintains regular contact with leaders in the region. He met with Prime Minister Netanyahu last Friday before we left New York, and I suspect he'll continue to stay in touch with them. I don't have any specific phone conversations to read out to you today, but this is obviously something that's been on his mind, as it is everybody here at the State Department, and he'll stay engaged on it.
On the same topic, are you concerned about the apparent excessive use of force that the Israeli army is using against Palestinians?
Certainly, we're aware of reports of that, and as we've made clear, we're deeply concerned about all this recent violence and the tensions, and we continue to condemn in the strongest possible terms the violence against both Israeli and Palestinian civilians. Obviously, we're going to be always concerned about any credible reports of excessive use of force against civilians. And as I've just said before, it's important that steps be taken to guard against this and to bring the tensions down.
In your judgment, this current round of violence, does it drive home the message that perhaps Palestinians under occupation and the Israeli settler population cannot live side by side, and maybe the time has come to make good on your statement declaring the settlement illegitimate? Is that the judgment on this building?
I wouldn't say that our statements haven't been made good on. We still stand by them, and I also would say that we still stand by the hope and the expectation that a two-state solution can be found.
So you can point out to an example where the Israelis have actually tore down a settlement as a result of your stated position on the settlements?
I can't point to the intent behind any one act of demolition. We've been very clear about our views on this, and as I said, we still continue to believe that a two-state solution can be found.
I have one last question on the settlement. I raised this question before in this room, and I want to ask it again. Now, there are a number of settlers in the thousands, 60,000 altogether, with American citizens and so on. Do you feel that you have any kind of leverage, perhaps, to convince those settlers, to sort of deconflict from that area or relocate and so on?
Our discussions are on settlements are largely with the Israeli government, Saeed, and again, we've made our position very, very clear on new settlements, and that's not going to change.
John, I'm just wondering if does the administration, and this is not intended to be purely a semantic point, but does the administration have a view as to whether this wave of violence that you condemned is criminal in nature, or is it actually terrorism?
We would consider the violent acts that we're talking about specifically here as acts of terror.
So, acts of terrorism. I mean, I know that this is again getting into semantics again,
Yes.
but
Yes.
terrorism. That you're referring to attacks by Palestinians against Israelis. Yes.
Yes.
The
terror.
stabbings and the
The
shootings.
stabbings, the shootings.
There was an
Terrorism,
incident
yes.
in Dimona, okay? Let's look at it from the other side. There was an incident in Dimona, I believe it was in Dimona, in southern Israel this morning, where an Israeli stabbed 4 Palestinians. Does that fall in the same category?
I don't
Or
have
is-
the details on that, Matt, so I'm not gonna, I'd really rather not get into
I understand.
event by event. I haven't seen the details on this, but I understand, and I understand the question. As I said, we do consider these particular acts of violence that we've seen, the stabbings, and the killings there, particularly in East Jerusalem, as terrorism. But I think I want to go back to the larger point here, which is all the violence needs to stop,
Right.
and calm does need to be restored.
Right. But the reason I asked the question is because, there was an incident in the United States, Sacramento, the other day, where one of the men who stopped the guy on the train from killing people was stabbed, right? And the immediate question was, well, was this just some kind of an altercation, or was it terrorism? Okay, it goes to how not only the local government approaches the incident of violence, but also how the international community responds to it, whether it is simply a robbery with a stabbing or whatever, or whether there's actually some broader intent behind it, like terrorism. So that's the reason why I asked the question. But so I just want to drill down and make sure you don't know the circumstances of the situation in Dimona, so you're not prepared to call that one incident terrorism?
I'm not at this point. I simply don't have the details of it, and I think you can understand. I'd prefer to know more before I make that kind of judgment.
But you have termed before settler attacks against Palestinians as terrorist attacks. You have. Correct? I mean, in the incident, let's say, in the village of Duma, when a settler burned a whole family down and so on, you call that an act of terror. We're still waiting on the Israelis to make good, for the lack of better words, on their commitment.
I don't know of any change in our position on that.
So you do term attacks by Israeli settlers or the Israeli settlers against
I think,
Palestinians.
without getting
As
into,
terror.
I don't want to get into a laundry list of
No,
every
I'm
act
just
of
trying to
violence,
follow
but
on what Matt was
I think
asking,
our
so
position has been very clear consistently in terms of what terrorism is and what it isn't, and again, let's not get wrapped up in definitions out of the dictionary. I'm not saying, and I'm not making light of the word terrorism. I understand, believe me, I understand the connotation of the word and what we're facing as a country around the world, and so many of our allies and partners are. But I think we're missing the point if we're going to get wrapped around the axle on this one word. What we want to see is the violence stop, calm restored, and real progress made, which we still believe is possible, towards a two-state solution. I got just time for a couple more. Yeah, go ahead, Gordon.
Another issue.
Quickly. John, sir, as far as U.S.-India trade and commerce relations are concerned in connection with TPP, how is it going to help or affect the relations with these 11 nations and U.S.-India relations going on?
Well, the Secretary spoke about this in broad terms in his statement when the agreement was reached in Atlanta. We believe it's good for not just American economic growth, but strategic relationships there in the region and the stability that can come from prosperity. And again, the Secretary looks forward to getting the agreement in force and to seeing what it can do for our prosperity, our security here at home and in the region. I think what we need to do now is to get it into force.
And finally, many Indian Americans and also many Indians in India are asking that whatever is going on between the two countries now, what happened here at the State Department, strategic dialogue, and so much going on between back and forth, is it going to be the same talks of the past, or we are going to move forward this time?
I think there's been enormous progress in U.S.-India relations, and certainly since Prime Minister Modi came into office. The relationship continues to deepen and grow on the security front and certainly diplomatically, and we look forward to that relationship continuing to grow and to deepen and to become more productive. I think everybody has every expectation that it will. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Follow up on this question. During the strategic and commercial dialogue, climate change was another important issue to be discussed between the two countries, and India has now announced its commitment on climate change before the Paris summit. Have you seen that? What is your response to it, India's commitment, INDC's?
I'm sorry.
Have you seen India's announcement and its commitment on climate change, which was announced on October 2nd? How do you say it?
I have not seen it, but obviously any contributions by India towards helping us deal with the problems of climate change and clean energy initiatives are welcome, and we would look forward to working in close cooperation to achieve those goals. I mean, it's obviously something the Secretary is very deeply concerned about, but you've got me a little bit unfamiliar with the specifics of that.
I'd also like to have your comment on about an Indian woman hands being chopped off in Saudi Arabia.
I haven't
Have
seen
you
that case.
Can you take that question?
I'll certainly take the question. I'm not familiar with that particular case.
In the neighborhood, again, on Afghanistan, today the Pakistan has again offered its resources for talks with the Taliban, peace talks with the Taliban. How do you say this?
Again, I haven't seen that development, but nothing's changed about our desire to see an Afghan-led reconciliation process move forward. That's important
And
for the
finally,
future of the region and for Afghanistan.
And finally, is the U.S. in talks with Pakistan on a separate civilian nuclear deal?
I don't have an update for you on that. Thanks, everybody.
Are you aware, has the administration at all changed its position on whether it would support an independent investigation into the Kunduz hospital bombing? I'm asking because there's a report with an interview with General Breedlove, in which he says that he would. I realize he's NATO, but he is an American general. As far as you know, has the administration changed its position on?
Not as far as I know. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.